This is the Herdgroin Lighthouse in South Shields, and today I'm going to be taking a whole bunch of overexposed pictures of it. If you'd like to know why, stay tuned. So the reason we are deliberately overexposing this Herdgroin lighthouse is because we're going to test out the relevance of shooting to the right in the modern digital era. Now, if you don't know what shooting to the right is, it's a technique that we used quite a lot back in the mid-noughties all the way through to the early 2010s. And the concept is that you push as much of the exposure to the right of the histogram. By doing that, what you're in effect doing is increasing the dynamic range of the sensor and reducing the noise in the shadow areas. Now, the theory is that sensors perform better at the higher end of their sensitivity, hence pushing that histogram all the way to the right. Now, to see how effective it is, I'm going to send you back to the studio and give you a quick demonstration on some images that I took on a Nikon D3 back in 2010. And I shot everything to the right, and you'll see just how good the effect was, just how powerful that effect was. So let's head back to the studio and have a quick look at those images, and I'll join you in a second. So these are the images that I was talking about at the Herdgroin Pier. They were a sequence of images taken in February 2009, and as you can see, it was taken in Antarctica of a ship in front of a large tabular iceberg. Now, because of the contrast between the bright whites of the ice and the dark hull of the ship, I elected to actually shoot this with the shooting to right technique. Now, to demonstrate exactly what I'm talking about, I picked out one particular image, which is probably my most popular image. And this is the original. This doesn't demonstrate it quite as much as some of the others, but it does show you how far you can go with this technique. And you can see in the histogram up here on the top right, it is predominantly bunched up to the far right of the histogram. There's no editing done to this, and if you zoom in, you can see it's a very, very clean image. This was a Nikon D3 at 12 megapixels, so the image is very, very clean. I think it was shot at base ISO of 200, and it's a lovely, lovely image. However, with some editing and pulling it back from the right, we get this. And this is a much more dramatic image. You can see the histogram has shifted all the way left so that the bulk of the image is now in the center, and you've got this really, really beautiful image. If I zoom in, you can see that there's hardly any noise caused by the editing of this image. The image is very, very clean, but it is also very, very striking. So back in 2009 on a Nikon D3, shooting to the right really did work, but does it today? So as you can see, it was a very, very powerful tool, but does it have any relevance today? Does it have relevance to a camera such as this one that I'm shooting on, the Sony Alpha 7 R5? Today we're going to find out by shooting a whole range of exposures of the Herdgroin lighthouse. So what we will do today is we'll take a whole range of exposures. We're shooting to the right, but we need to keep that exposure just on the inside of the histogram. Now, histograms work off JPEG, so you can actually go slightly over given the dynamic range of a RAW. So by bracketing, we'll make sure that we can push it slightly beyond the histogram, but get it back in post-production without any issues. And now in post-production, what we do is we bring the exposure back down to the middle, and then we expand the shadows and highlights, the blacks and whites, in order to get the image. So let's crack on and let's get some shots of this Herdgroin lighthouse while we've got these bright skies, got the relatively dark lighthouse, these beautiful bright skies, and we're going to try and get some shots and see what we can actually do with that. So I'm starting at -1 stop, and we're going to take an image there, and we're just going to move it in 1/3 stops and bring it through all the way to the right hand side of the histogram. And that's the correct exposure. On the correct exposure, as I said, it looks quite dark, but I'm sure in post-production that will actually come up quite nicely. But the real test is to see how much better, if at all, it will be if we shoot it to the right of the histogram. So we'll now click over and start overexposing the image by 1/3 of a stop at a time. And now at 1.3 overexposure, we are just on the right-hand edge of the histogram. And I'm going to push it a couple of third stops beyond that as well, just to see how far it will go. And we're now at 2 stops over the metered exposure. The highlight warning is showing quite a lot of clipped highlights, but whether we can pull that back or not, we'll find out in post-production. So that's all the images shot. It's a gorgeous morning, but it's still late February, so it's pretty cold here. I'm going to head home, back to the studio, cup of coffee, and we'll drop these images into Lightroom and see just whether shooting to the right actually works in 2025. So join me in the studio very soon. So welcome back to the studio. I have the images in Lightroom. I took probably a couple of hundred images in total, but I picked out one sequence, and from that sequence I've picked the regular normal exposure, and then I've picked one that's 1.7 stops over and one that is 2 stops over. Now I've actually worked on the one that's 2 stops over as well as the regular exposure, and the results are quite interesting. So I'm going to take you through them in Lightroom and show you exactly how they came out and what my final thoughts are. So stay tuned to the end and I'll let you know what I think of shooting to the right in modern cameras, and let's get into Lightroom. So this is the image that is 2 stops overexposed. And if we go to the develop module, you can see that I've put the highlight clipping on in the histogram. And if I switch that on and off, you can see that there is quite a substantial amount of clipping. Now, if you remember, I said back at the Herd groin that when you shoot to the right, you need to be aware that RAW files have a little bit extra dynamic range beyond what the histogram on the camera is actually saying, because that histogram is actually based on the JPEG. So this is as far as I actually went, and I've had to play around with this and have a look at this. If I pull the exposure back and back and back so that we bring the histogram back towards the middle, we've got no clipping on the highlights and we've got no clipping at all on the shadow areas. Now obviously the image is dark, but without any clipping we know that we've got that exposure back from 2 stops overexposed. So what we'll do now is we'll actually do a little bit of work on this image to make it look acceptable. And the first thing we'll do is we'll just bring the whites up to the edge of clipping, just there. You can see the little red marks coming in just in the very edge of the sky there. And we'll bring the blacks down so that they're just above clipping as well. And now we'll just whack the shadows up and to get the light back into that lighthouse. And there you go. You see, at +70, we've got plenty of light in that lighthouse. It actually looks really quite nice. I'll bring it back very slightly. And then I'm going to bring the highlights down just to bring some more definition into the sky as well. And there we have a good, if not particularly stunning image. But the important thing is, when we added that shadow detail, did we bring any noise into the shadow areas? And I think the answer to that is no, there's really not an awful lot of noise in there. This is at 200%. This is a 61 megapixel sensor. And as you can see, there's very little noise to be seen in that particular image. That's quite a good result for an image that was technically 2 stops overexposed according to the meter. So if we go to the regular exposure, and as you can see, it's very dark, but in the histogram, everything is inside the histogram. We're bunched a little bit to the left, but we're well inside on the right. And this was the metered exposure. We take that over into the Lightroom Develop module, and we'll bring the exposure up so that we get the bulk of the exposure back in the middle. And we'll just bring the blacks up very slightly to take the clipping out. And then we'll bring the whites up a little bit to the edge there as well. And now we'll do the same again. We'll bring those shadows up in order to bring some detail into the lighthouse, a little like that, and bring the highlights down again to bring a little bit of definition into the sky. Now, if I zoom in on the lighthouse now, again at 200%, you can see that there is some significant noise in that lighthouse. And that quite surprised me. Now, obviously the camera did underexpose to some extent because of this contrast between the large bright sky and the dark lighthouse, which is relatively small. But that was the correct metered exposure, and very often people will just work to the correct metered exposure and not really look at their histogram. Now if I go back to the library module, and we'll pull these two images up side by side, and we'll do an A-B comparison. On the left we have the one that was the normal exposure, on the right we have the one that was the 2 stops overexposed. And if we zoom in on both, you can see there is quite a difference in the amount of noise in these images, particularly if we come down here. You can see a lot of noise in the reds here on the regular exposure as opposed to the overexposed image, which has very little noise in it. And I think if we come down to the pier in the background here and have a look at that, that should highlight quite well the difference. Here you have a look at the pier and you see there's a lot of noise in that shadow area of the pier, and there's very little in the pier on the one that was 2 stops overexposed. So, is shooting to the right relevant in 2025? I would say yes, certainly with a high megapixel sensor such as the Alpha 7 R5 in images that have very high contrast, it worked, and it worked perhaps even better than the D3 back in 2010. That might be because of the pixel density being much higher, but overall there was definitely a big difference in image quality and noise between the overexposed image and the regular exposed image, the overexposed being better. That surprised me. I was expecting the result to be more in favour of the regular exposure given modern day technology and sensors, but it's proved not to be. So do you shoot to the right? Have you shot to the right before? Let me know in the comments your experience of shooting to the right in high contrast scenes. If you've enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up, and a subscription would be even better, and I will see you in the next one.